Welcome back, everyone. This is Balkan Devlan, and we're continuing with our interviews on global catastrophic and existential risks with scholars working on this field. Today we have Nathan Sears, a PhD student from University of Toronto. Thanks for coming on to this, Nathan.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So, could you tell us a little bit about your background, and how you end up getting involved and interested in existential risks?
Great. Well, as you said, I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in political science. I study international relations. And before that, I was a professor of international relations at the Universidad de las Americas in Ecuador. Taught courses on international security, geopolitics, was very interested in nuclear weapons, nuclear deterrence, and arms control. So in terms of how I got interested in existential risk, I think it would probably begin about 10 years ago when I started really studying nuclear weapons. As I say, deterrence, arms control, the risks of failure. I was also previously, as an undergraduate student, a student of history. So I was very interested in the history of the Cold War. So while in international relations, I kind of consider myself to be a realist, classical realist, I've always been sort of fascinated by how this logic of realism and realpolitik confronts the existential threat of nuclear weapons, and how the logic of realism starts to break down under the threat of nuclear war.
Morgenthau's solution is the world state, right? When you look at
exactly.
the politics among nations, that's what he comes with. I mean, he has a whole chapter on world government there.
Exactly, and he's probably the IR scholar who's most influenced my thinking. And he and John Hurst, both, these classical realists, confront this problem of nuclear weapons, and they think the nation state is, antithetical to existential threat of nuclear war, which has shaped my thinking on a lot of these problems. Now, when I made the turn towards existential risk more broadly, it was really just starting to notice how, it's no longer just nuclear weapons. Climate change and species extinction really did it for me, where it was just like watching this very stark evidence of what we're doing to the ecosystem and the sustainability of life on planet Earth, and then learning more and more about different types of emerging tech risks. I mean, CRISPR blows my mind. The arguments about superintelligence seem very plausible. So I think it was really around 2016 where I just started, it's the proliferation of existential threats that started to shape my thinking and push me into this field. But as I say, since I'm coming from an IR background, an international security background, that it's the intersection between these two things that has most been, I think, shape the way in which I think about existential risks, and also kind of focuses my sort of career and scholarly path at the intersection between these two.
You have a recent paper out on existential security, and I want to get to that at some point in this talk. But before getting into that, once you sort of start looking at existential risks more sort of broadly speaking, and you mentioned that our ability, in a way, to let ourselves go extinct increased significantly over the last few decades. I mean, previously, perhaps the primary threats were, natural causes, right? Super volcanoes, asteroid strikes, sudden emergence of a super pandemic, that kind of thing. But at least with the advent of nuclear weapons, and then with synthetic biology, upcoming nanotech, AI stuff, now we have more chances and tools to wipe ourselves out, and that seems to be a major stimulus, in a way, for a lot of the work being done in the past maybe 20 years. I mean, if you date it, the field to Bostrom's 2002 paper in the last decade and a half, maybe, is driven by that. When you look at the field, when you look at what has been discussed so far, it's quite a young field in that sense. What set of existential or global catastrophic risks you find to be more worrisome, and that we need to focus on?
I think that my take on this will perhaps differ a little bit from others in the field who are perhaps might answer this question by focusing on a specific type of threat, whether it's nuclear or climate change or AI or whatnot. For me, it's great power politics.
Okay.
It's really maybe because, as I say, what I studied before was history and, of course, teaching international security and great power politics. I'm very interested in the intersection between this sort of notion of national self-help, power and security competition between, the great powers, and how this intersects and could very much exacerbate a whole range of existential risks. While people living today think perhaps, or born in the last few decades might think that living under the nuclear sort of Damocles is just normal, we could blow ourselves up tomorrow, right? The threat of nuclear weapons has not gone away and is under significant pressure, whether it's, the personalities who have the nuclear codes, the undermining of the nuclear taboo that makes these weapons, the use of them, unthinkable, whether it's emerging tech challenges to the actual nuclear capabilities of command and control, second strike capabilities becoming more vulnerable, or whether it's just, the hegemonic decline of the United States and the rise of China. There's a whole lot of pressure on nuclear risks, but it doesn't end with that, right? You see the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement being very much shaped in sort of this relative gains, relative losses type thinking with respect to economic competitiveness. So the more in which the United States and China or other states see themselves as locked in this sort of relative gains competition, the less likely they are to cooperate on these sort of global problems. And then the more they focus on technological competition as really the way in which you gain an upper hand, the less likely they are to prioritize managing these risks collectively, whether it's AI or, again, biotech. If every state determines its own procedures for managing these technological risks, that's a much less safe world, right? So I'm really interested in how this sort of logic of great power politics, which is thousands of years old and unlikely to change overnight, could drive or exacerbate these risks that are novel or not.
Bringing back sort of the politics into the debate, I think, is an important, very important thing and missing. And I think a lot of the political science and IR crowd, our contribution to the field, I think, is bringing that back, and that's, I think, very important. I
think so too. There's this Martin Rees calls himself a technical optimist, but a political pessimist. And I find that an interesting quote because that's actually really tough to be. I personally can't be very optimistic about technology while being a political pessimist. Technology is not produced in a political vacuum. Right? Politics shapes what technologies are produced, how they're used, and to what ends, right?
And who uses them as well.
Who uses them, right? Look at splitting the atom, right? The technological capacity to split the atom didn't necessitate the creation of nuclear weapons. That's a political problem.
Exactly. And once to me, that's sort of, again, the field is very young and a lot of things are being sorted out and there's still a lot of low-hanging fruit there in terms of the research. But I think there is an increasing recognition of two things. One is that it might, we have sort of debated and discussed these things as in silos. So, looking at volcanoes as a distinct or discrete risk, or AI as a discrete risk. But now that we have some sense of the map, now we need to think about it as matrices of risks, right? And how they interact. So that's number one. Number two is that I think increasing concern and realization that the politics of it is fundamental to it. Otherwise, you end up coming with sort of technological solutions that, as the economics joke go, let's assume a can opener. Let's assume there is global governance. Let's assume there is one single global society for all these things to work. And that's not, I mean, the whole debate about mushrooms, for example, one world sort of argument flies in the face of the whole IR and history, and the fact that we are very much territorial based political entities going back several millennia.
Exactly.
So that perspective is a lot needed, I think. So that's extremely important.
Yep.
Taking from there and then pivoting to understanding these risks. Science is fundamentally, of course, is about methodology, right? About finding things, an approach to get a handle on these things. When you think about existential risks and looking at it from different perspectives, what sort of methods of thinking through these risks you find promising and useful?
Well, it strikes me that when we're talking about, human survival, we're inevitably in only have one case, right? N equals one. So I feel like we're, at least in some respect, always in the domain of the qualitative methodology. But more than methodology in terms of qualitative or quantitative, I am interested in more this question of ways of thinking about existential threats. And I think that one of the strengths thus far of the existential risk literature has been sort of to marry this scientific, technical, and philosophical, ethical ways of thinking about the problems. Often within social sciences, we kind of bracket the normative and ethical arguments. It's almost like an asocial social science, right? I think that existential risk has really been about bringing these two things together: the scientific and technical study of risks, again, from the natural to understanding sort of the technical dynamics behind AI or other emerging techs, as well as sort of like these philosophical and ethical arguments about them. So I think that's promising. I wouldn't want in the pursuit of a more scientific or technical understanding of existential risks, and especially like as social science comes into this, I wouldn't want to lose that philosophical, ethical thinking, right? But they need to be in discussion with each other, I think. A second strength is the interdisciplinary nature, right? By talking about this spectrum of existential risks, which is broad and growing, means almost by definition that we have to be interdisciplinary in thinking about knowledge, again, scientific or technical knowledge from various disciplines. However, the social sciences has lagged behind, both in its contribution to the existential risk research agenda, as well as how it's been influenced by it. So we've been talking about that, but I think that bringing social science methodology and social science ways of knowing or thinking about things could be very promising. And there's enormous scope, right? Social sciences is a very broad tent. I think, everything from psychology to international relations could contribute something. I'm actually interested, to use psychology, which I know next to nothing about. It strikes me that it would be very interesting to understand how human minds try to grasp existential threats and the challenges in how humans think or fail to think about existential threats. Why it is that we seem to be paralyzed by the enormity of these threats. I mean, you see the American Psychological Association, coming up with this diagnosis of climate anxiety and depression, right? This is interesting. So that's a potential contribution. And of course, it can be economics, sociology and political science. So I think that's promising. And so with that introduction of social science more into this area will come the sort of methodologies of social science.
I mean, I agree. There's a lot that social science can contribute, particularly. I mean, there is work that's, as we were talking before we started recording, my coming is through forecasting into this, particularly the whole heuristics and biases approach, Kahneman and Tversky and Phil Tetlock and others, and the whole judgment and decision making sort of tradition within psychology and political science and decision making sciences give us quite a bit of grounding and tools to understand why overall the human species is is not very good at thinking about tailored risks. Why we I mean, why we actually are not intuitive Bayesians, why we are not intuitively sort of engaging with these very low probability, understanding and reacting and preparing for those low probability by high impact events, etc., etc. There's a lot to work through, because that's fundamentally as a political issue that requires action to be able to deal with at least some of them. Certain things you can't do much, right? For volcanoes, you can't really do much. But for AI or for synthetic biology or other things, it requires a certain governance institutional structures, which is about the political design of those mechanisms. And that forces or needs to be with, it depends on people's understanding. Right? So it is important that there's a lot that we can social sciences can and do bring it. And I sort of really like the fact that you actually highlighted the ethics component of it. I think there is also a lot of room to expand on the sort of the ethical debate within the existentialist community. I think there is also outside contribution to it. I mean, right now when you look at it, not everybody, but the majority of people working within it comes from effective altruism perspective, which is not necessarily the only way of looking at it, and which may or may not be the best way to, if you want to also bring more people into the debate, and convince more people to pay attention and devote resources, right? So there are other ethical perspectives that should take existentialism more seriously, and bringing that, I think, is also a very fundamental contribution that classical realists, I'm a card-carrying member of classical realism, can do about that. And I think that's fundamentally important.
I think you're absolutely right. In fact, I think it's probably something that we'll come back to, because this is I think one of the areas in which future research should be looking at, particularly in the philosophical ethical domain, would be going beyond Western philosophy, and particularly pretty Anglo-Western philosophy.
Analytic philosophy is basically what it is. I mean, it's mostly within that tradition that this is coming out. It's very consequentialist. And I mean, Phil Torres has a working paper on taking a virtue ethics perspective, for example, on and again, as a classical realist, I'm much more sort of partial to that, with the whole
I am as well.
Phronesis and Puritan's and all that kind of thing. So I find it very, very promising to get at that. Let's pivot from here to how you actually sort of combine those two, the fields, IR, security studies, and existential risk. And you recently wrote a paper, Existential Security. Could you walk us a little bit through the paper? What was your concern? What's your main argument? And what did you try to do in that paper?
Well, in that paper, it's part of a broader, I guess, effort personally to bring in sort of IR theorizing and security studies to grapple with existential risks. In that paper, I'm very interested in how, look, security studies often talks about security as being about survival. There's a fairly common theoretical logic behind security. I refer to it in the paper as protection from threats to the survival of some referent object, whether that be the human being, the nation state, or humanity. That tends to be a consistent theoretical logic, though the empirical content of what the threats are, what that referent object are, what protection looks like can change, right? So that is sort of imported from security studies. But if you look in security studies, it's pretty consistent in its failure to think about these types of existential threats, right? It's really much more focused on national survival. When you talk about security or survival within IR or security studies, you're almost by definition talking about national survival, right? The the reproduction of the political sovereignty of the nation state or its territorial integrity as independent political entities. Right? This is really what national security and security almost by fiat becomes. So I was really interested in pushing that logic, consistent theoretical logic, beyond that referent object of the nation state, as well as using human security as another foil, where it becomes about the protection of life of individual human beings or civilian populations, because our capacity to provide security to individuals is fairly limited at the international level. So I was interested in first opening up that concept of that constitutive question of what is security and applying it to these sorts of existential threats. But then going beyond that to also show why, if we think in terms of, say, national security or human security, we're not really able to deal with adequately these types of existential threats. And in fact, if we follow a national security frame, we may exacerbate them because of some of the problems that I discussed earlier about competition, relative gains, just these sorts of actions that you do to, increase the security of your nation may end up decreasing the security of all of us, which is really a theoretical problem that we see a lot in security studies, right? It's the security dilemma, but it's a security dilemma at the level of existential threats to humanity. It's like an existential security dilemma, essentially. So that was a little bit of what I was interested in framing in this piece. But my other work goes even beyond that to think in terms of world orders and things like that. So.
No, I mean I think that's quite interesting and an important sort of debate that we need to have. Of course, what it comes to is again the catch-22, right? The idea is that how would you be able to achieve a different equilibrium in terms of political forces and arrangements if the existing arrangements poses a threat, but that the incentives out there, short-term incentives of the powerful actors that are actually holding the system together runs counter to the long-term interest, right? So that, without changing that dynamic, you can't move there. But in order to change that dynamic, you need to have access to the levers of power or different institutional organizations. How do we move from one set of one equilibrium to another?
Well, I guess this is where my sort of classical realist cynicism / pessimism comes in. I'm pretty skeptical or not so optimistic about our possibilities for doing so. And to the extent that our responses to these sorts of problems need to be prioritized now or within the coming decades, we may very much, if anything, be going in the opposite direction in these coming decades. Right? We may see very much a major step backwards towards more parochial definitions of the national interest, more competitive international system, much less leadership. So that's a serious problem. I have another piece which hopefully will be published in the next little while. It was a lot of fun to write. It was about, there are often these discussions in the existential risk community about the Fermi paradox, and there's the notion of this self-destruction hypothesis.
The great filter, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And mine is a political take, an IR take on this. And I asked the question of, does the technological capacity for self-destruction grow faster than the political capacity to control and restrain it? And if it does, then that could explain the Fermi paradox, right? Civilizations develop the technological capacity to destroy themselves before they develop the political capacity to prevent their self-destruction. So like, to come back to Kenneth Waltz, it's sort of like self-destructions occur because there's nothing to prevent them.
One of my favorite contemporary political theorists, philosophers, is John Gray, and he precisely make that argument that the way we sort of look at the moral evolution or the progress of humanity is lagging significantly more than our technological evolution, and thus talking about technological progress, we come so far doesn't necessarily mean that the sort of the moral component or our ability to deal with those new forms of technology also evolved, co-evolved at the same time. And of course, he's also quite pessimistic, or as I like to call it, myself, cautiously pessimistic. People tend to be cautiously optimistic. I tend to be cautiously pessimistic. About the future. So that is a fundamental issue, and to think, and this might be very perhaps a bit too jaded, but to think that we would somehow the ex machina, figure out things when we are at dire need and then survive is very hubristic. There is nothing really makes the human species special or outside
Right.
the realm of other species which went extinct, about 99% of them. So there is no sort of guaranteed last minute Hollywood ending that we will eventually enlighten ourselves and move and out of it and then live happily ever after. And I find that sort of techno optimism component quite depressing in a way within the community,
Yeah.
right?
We agree on that completely. I think that, again, coming back to the Fermi paradox, when we look out at the night sky and see no evidence of intelligent life, that should encourage humility and, and a little bit of worry. But instead, it seems to create hubris in terms of we're in charge of our own destiny, right? Well, yes, but that can be dangerous.
Exactly. No, I think it's fascinating, and I really like to read that paper, the other one that you're working on. I just want to sort of pivot to one thing that I'd like to get your ideas on, and as someone who's working on this field and coming from an IR background. Most of the students in this course are also political science or IR background as well. And if they're interested in working within this field, what your advice would be? What are the promising avenues for research? What skills you think would be beneficial going forward?
Yeah, I've got, I think, a few things to say there. The first, before I forget it, because it's important, and we should always be talking about this with graduate students, but in particular in this area, is mental health.
Yes.
Always figure out how to think the unthinkable without allowing it to crush you.
Yes.
Right? Again, to go back to the notion of climate anxiety or depression, I think that young people today are at serious risk of these sorts of problems, right? The baby boomers have left us with a lot of problems that they didn't manage to grapple with, and now we're going to have to grapple with those and a whole range of new ones that are emerging now and which will emerge in the future. So, as someone who just mentioned about my cynicism and pessimism, it's important to be able to manage that. And for me, this was actually writing a dissertation or jumping into this research area almost as a very rational decision in order to manage this sort of lower level anxiety that I felt about nuclear weapons, about climate change, about all of these other sorts of threats, right? To intellectualize it, to treat it as a scientific domain in order to not worry about it so at a subconscious level, right? So I don't know if that's a strategy that would help others, but I would just keep that as something that students who want to enter this domain kind of have to think about, right? It might not be for everybody in terms of mental health. I don't know how many people I've spoken to who, when I tell them about what it is that I research, they're like, oh my God, how can you spend your time thinking about that? I just want to shut that out.
Yeah.
And, maybe for a lot of people is a way of coping. For me, that didn't help. So it was very much like, let's intellectualize this. Let's turn it into science and so on, right? In terms of future directions for research, I would say that from what I know of the research agenda on catastrophic and existential risk, it's highly empirical. There's lots of like case-specific threats, and I talk about a case as if like AI is a case, nuclear weapons are a case, right? Or surveys of risks. So I'm thinking about, Leslie's The End of the World,
Mm-hmm.
Martin Rees's Our Final Century, Richard Posner's Catastrophe, Phil Torres's, Morality and Foresight.
Mm-hmm.
Those are like these, or the one by both Bosterman, Scrivo, and
Yeah.
John, Global Catastrophic Risks. These are like these nice discipline-orienting books, I would say, and they're surveys.
Yes.
Right, so there's a lot of this empirical and whether case studies or surveys of risks. There's also a lot of work that tries to construct like taxonomies about classifying risks. I think that's useful. It's necessary foundational work. I do this kind of also in my paper with the 2x2 that looks at natural versus anthropogenic.
We're political scientists. We like our 2x2s.
Yeah, we like our 2x2s, but that only gets us so far. So we've done the empirical, we've done the taxonomies. I think what's lacking is theory. Okay. I think existential risk, the research agenda, is under-theorized, and there's a lot that could be done in terms of, theoretical work in terms of causal explanation. Why do we see this proliferation of threats is an interesting one. And then, implications for governance and social systems and vice versa. For social science, what are the social dynamics that drive this proliferation, and what does it mean for those social dynamics? That I think is really important. And it helps us to potentially problematize some of the assumptions that exist in this existential risk research agenda. A huge one that I find interesting is this sort of teleological assumption about technology that whatever technology can be produced must be produced. Why? Right? Why do we, but it's like almost a bedrock assumption in this literature. And it's weird because it's a social assumption, right? But if you look at history, there are huge periods of time in many regions that are more or less static in terms of technological development. The notion of this inevitable progress of technology actually reflects a small period of time, right? It's more or less the Enlightenment and its effects. So it's interesting that assumption has become so dominant. So I think that theorizing some of these things a little bit better could be a good area for progress. And there are some bits of that, right? Again, in John Leslie's book, there's the doomsday argument, which is a theoretical concept for this area. Phil Torres' book, I think, is one of the best in terms of trying to theorize. The concept of weapons of total destruction or these agent tool couplings, like these are ways to theorize the problem. But we can go a lot further, I think, in that.
There's a lot of, the technology optimism is quite interesting because there's a lot of path dependency in the technology development. When I talk about the path dependency in technology, I tend to sort of give the example of alternative current versus the direct current debate with Tesla and others, right? That is your typical example of how a particular technology is very path dependent, despite the efficiencies, the other effects, etc., of the direct current versus the alternative current. One was chosen because of the social, political economic, institutional structures that those technologies are evolved and thus shaped. And then we don't really use the other one at all and not really further developed, right? So to me, the sort of the apolitical and a complete asocial aspect of as if technology evolves and develops outside society is just not accurate reflection of how these actually work.
I think that's absolutely right. It's a weird sort of asocial, apolitical notion. Short of true artificial intelligence or artificial superintelligence, again, it's not that the technology produces the technology. It's human agency that drives the production of technology. So I think we need to problematize the assumption that it's going to just continue, blah, 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 in order to understand what dynamics make that happen, right? My PhD supervisor, Stephen Bernstein, looks at actually, super wicked problems and looks at those path dependencies and actually sees them as a potential way of mitigating some of the problematic path dependencies with respect to climate change. He talks about binding our future selves by investing in, technologies that we'll need to continue to invest in, but that lead us towards a different trajectory. So actually, seeing the problematic path dependencies, seeing more beneficial path dependencies, and using them, exploiting them. So it's interesting. It is very much focused on the social dynamics behind these.
Yes, and again, one thing I really enjoy this field is that the interdisciplinary of it, right? So once you start thinking about path dependencies and locking in on one or the other, you immediately could bring in the game theoretical discussions about credible commitments, going back to the whole also the nuclear deterrence debate and so on and so forth, and the usefulness of the bargaining, the cost of signaling, and all that debate and literature and theoretical frameworks to design mechanisms that reduces the risk, or at least reduces the uncertainty surrounding this particular risks going forward. But treating the whole particular technological component as completely as theoretical as social is one of, I think, one of the biggest blind spots. And it's funny because it should not necessarily be the case. When you look at the AI safety and alignment debate, it is all about path dependency. It's all about ensuring that we don't go to put ourselves in a particular path that we cannot go back. So we have to figure it out now. We have to figure out the alignment issue. We have to figure out the AI safety issue now, so that we are not locked into a path that we cannot control later on. Exactly. We have to broaden that to the field.
And I say the same again for my specific focus on this intersection with great power politics. I mean, we need to solve the security dilemma now, because it's going to be much harder 10 or 20 or 30 years from now, right? The Cold War lasted 45 years. The quote unquote German threat to the European balance of power lasted more than half a century. So we don't have a half a century to deal with a lot of these threats, right? No. So we need to deal with the security dilemma today, and so that we don't have those sort of path dependencies that shape how we manage these other sorts of threats, right? So I totally see IR, political science, but social science in general, able to contribute a lot. And it actually is kind of interesting that the study of existential risk didn't begin in international relations or the social sciences, that it really began with, Nick Bostrom, Martin Rees, and some of these others in the first place. Like, I find it so funny that we're talking about survival and it's not security studies that's forefront, right? But anyway.
No, I mean, go ahead.
No, before pivoting to another direction, feel free to jump in.
No, so what I wanted to sort of highlight from your comments is the fact that the field is very interdisciplinary and requires different skills to be able to bring it. So yes, it helps if you have some familiarity with the mathematics or the science component of certain risks, but you don't have to be an engineer, you don't have to be a mathematician, you don't have to be a physicist or a computer geek to get involved and work on these issues, because of the whole multidimensional nature of analyzing these things, and those social skills, let me put it that way, theorizing, connecting the historical component and so on and so forth, is actually not that common within the field, so that it would actually provide a competitive advantage for people coming from IR or political science or history or other backgrounds to come into that.
No more than you needed to be a nuclear physicist to really understand the risk of nuclear proliferation.
Exactly, right? Exactly. So I found it fascinating. Before wrapping up, because I also want people to watch this, so I don't want to go too overboard with the timing. I generally wrap up with these to briefly talk about COVID-19 as a lot of people's sort of minds around this. It's not an existential risk. It's not even a global catastrophic risk at all. But it is a sort of a dry run, a mock run of how societies in plural, but also us as individuals, can comprehend or try to deal with highly disruptive events. So when you look at what is going on right now, what do you think, the study of existential risk can tell us about comprehending and sort of planning for the COVID-19 crisis going forward, and vice versa? What is going on right now tell us about how we are equipped or not to deal with even greater catastrophes.
One thing, well, here, there are a few thoughts that occur to me right in this moment. The one would be, I mean, when here in Canada, it was basically the third week of March that everything was changing very quickly. That was a very interesting week to be alive and a social scientist looking at this, and someone who studies catastrophic and existential risk and everything like that, because it was sort of a moment where it was kind of like a I told you so moment in terms of the vulnerability of social systems to these sort of, and as you say, this is not an existential risk by any means. It's even debatable about the catastrophic risk. It's more of a catastrophic risk to, you know, economies and things like that than to human life. It's not the Spanish flu or influenza of the early 20th century even, right? So it was interesting sort of wake-up call for the vulnerability of social systems, which I think before most people would have said, what do you mean this can't be disrupted? These social systems are strong and durable and resilient, and it shows us that that's not true. So of course, a lot of people are now drawing the links with climate change, and I think that that's a valid way to think about the problem. You know, apply that knowledge to climate change. The other, which is a little more germane to my sort of argumentation and the things that I look at, is the assumption that a threat to all of us is what's necessary or sufficient to produce a sort of collective response. You know, there's like that sort of notion of the hypothetical notion of like aliens invading, and that's what's necessary to bring humans together. Well, okay, that's probably not going to happen. So what about things like climate change or a pandemic, or, you know, these other sort of common threats, and the notion that that would make us all collectively respond to them? Well, what we're seeing is that that's not necessarily the case, right? The turn into the nation state has been pretty powerful. There are still elements of this collective response. It's not completely gone either, and hopefully in the months and years that follow, that will be a big part of the debate. People say, well, look, this is how we responded. That was not at all good. We need to reform and create stronger global institutions to deal with global threats. But what this shows is that that is by no means like necessarily the outcome. So I find that to be very interesting. And then a third is that I think that this is hopefully a bit of a wake-up call for policymakers, that they need to prioritize those sorts of low probability, high consequence threats that just don't make it in to the everyday discussions and in policymaking forums because of more banal and you know, everyday problems. So that, I think, is the relationship for me between you know, the catastrophic and existential risk and COVID-19.
I mean, to me, unless we find a way to solve the misaligned incentives for the policymakers and politicians, it will be extremely hard to sustain a focus on generally on catastrophic risks from them. I mean, I have no doubt that from now on, they will pay attention and devote resources for pandemics. But like in IR, we always fight the last war. The next catastrophe that is not necessarily going to be a pandemic. But there is no trophy for preventing things in politics, right? The incentive structure is to fix the problems, right? There's the whole debate about, you know, fundamentally, politics is also about creating problems to solve them. And nobody elects you because you are very cautious and you take things so nothing happened. And unless we find a way to incentivize for the policymakers and politicians to pay attention to non-events as much as they pay attention to events, I'm not very optimistic going forward that beyond this particular crisis, that we would more broadly devote resources. We will probably a bit, but not to the extent that's going to happen, right? So to me, that's one sort of one issue, and that's one of the super wicked problems. How do you deal with that? It's a hard problem. How do you resolve that? Is very hard.
Yeah, extremely difficult. It's.
And I don't have any answers. I mean, I'm just.
No, nor do I. I mean, empirically, it's much easier for us to look at policy failures rather than policy successes, right?
Exactly. Especially if it is about prevention, right?
Exactly.
Because a successful prevention looks like nothing happens.
Exactly.
Another thing I think the COVID sort of highlights is that we have been talking about this with Luke the other day. It should actually dampen the techno optimism. Now all eyes and resources are on developing a vaccine.
Right.
If we can't, and there's no guarantee that we will, that should really, make us think about all those supposed technological developments that would enable us conquer the stars. If we can get a hold of a single strand of RNA and figure it out, I would be much more sort of, cautious about whether we will be able to develop all these other fancy technologies.
Yeah, I agree. And then also, there's not been much discussion in terms of, deeper critique of social systems that allowed this to happen in the first place. Managing our relation with animals and nature and wildlife and all of these sorts of things, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And this was actually one of the points I was going to add in terms of, philosophy and ethics and talking about non-Western philosophies, but also anthropocentrism, right?
Yes.
And this is huge. And my piece can be absolutely criticized for this, right? And putting at the forefront of existential security, the survival of humanity, there's a lot of anthropocentrism in that, right? But we really need to reevaluate our relationship of human civilization with nature and with other species. And COVID-19 is a big reminder of that, but there's not much talk in terms of critiquing the sort of relationship with nature and wildlife and animal species that has allowed this to happen. Right?
And again, I mean, I think you don't really have to buy into the whole pan-species argument to actually realize that you could have a very specious perspective, which I think, at least from my sort of coming up, it makes sense. But the whole idea is that it actually harms the species when you're not sort of taking into account the other species that you're interacting and sharing an ecosystem with. If you don't continue to exploit them and continue to not sort of care about how you interact with them, it would actually harm you. So you don't have to be altruistic in that sense towards other species. Pure self interest should guide you sufficiently to pay attention to that relationship. And I think perhaps this is a wake-up call. You don't really have to care about all other species to actually realize that, what we are doing is actually harming us as well.
Right. Human civilization does not exist in a vacuum. It exists on planet Earth. And
Exactly. Precisely. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for this chat. I think it has been fantastic.
Fun discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. Much appreciated that you come along.
Okay.